Welcome to episode 119 of the Flying Free podcast. Today I have with me Meghan. Is it Chance? I meant to ask you before we recorded. Is it Chance?
No, I mean, close. It's Chance. It's like Chance with a British accent. So,
I like that. I like that a lot. It's Meghan Chance.
Yes, you got it.
Who is the host of the Faith and Feminism podcast. And by the way, if you're not familiar with that one, I highly recommend it. Go grab it. Your podcast is about the same age as this one. I believe we started right around the same time. And we connected first on that podcast. I think you interviewed me. Well, I don't think.
I did.
I think you might have interviewed me. So you interviewed me and now I get to interview you. It's super fun.
Yeah.
Meghan is a writer. She's got a brand new book out called Women Rising, Learning to Listen, Reclaiming Our Voice. And she has a passion for empowering women and reclaiming feminism for the Christian faith, which I totally love. And in this interview, we're going to find out why this is her passion and how she went from being a normal Christian to being a Christian who actively confronts injustice against women while pointing to a biblical standard for gender equality. So welcome, Meghan.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Like I said, or like Natalie said, I had her on my podcast about 2 years ago and had a lot of good feedback from women. What you're doing is so important. I hear stories again and again and again, even in my faith and feminism group, so many women are going through these really messy divorces and they didn't even necessarily realize that they were being abused for so long because of the way that the church had framed things, and it was hard for them to identify. And so I've pointed a lot of people to the resources that you have, and it's so important. I can think of so many women who have been helped through the work that you're doing. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I'm so glad you could come. That is kind of the outcome. It's like the natural outcome of that kind of theology that sort of marginalizes women. So I want you to tell us about your new book in just a little bit. But first, we would like to hear about the journey that you took that brought you to this place of standing in the gap for half of the human race that's been marginalized and exploited all throughout history and in every place on the planet. So let's start by going back to when you were a missionary who worked with exploited women. Can you tell us about the injustices that you saw?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started doing missions work after I grew up in a conservative culture that told me that as a woman, the closest thing I could get to with God is missionary work, because I wasn't allowed to preach. I wasn't allowed to teach. So I'm like, okay, this is the only option left to show how much I love God and serve others. And so I was like, okay, well, as a woman, I have to be a missionary because this is the most holy thing I could do, or so I thought. And so,
or be a pastor's wife.
Yeah.
If you were a pastor's wife, that was a close second.
Yes. Close second, pastor's wife. For some reason, the missionary life appealed more to me, maybe because I realized, or what I was taught about marriage is I was my own person until I got married. And then I had to defer to my husband and everything, including my relationship with God, this whole spiritual household thing. And so wasn't really ready to give that up quite yet, or maybe ever. So anyways, I got into mission work. I went on a program called the World Race, which is an 11-country, 11-month trip. And almost immediately started encountering misogyny and sexism within the church. The first month I was there, we encountered a contact who told us that women should be seen but not heard in the church, that women's worship should be inaudible while men's should be audible. And I was like, well, what does that even mean? Because he had people women giving testimony, but there was just all of these rules. And he kept on talking about God's order and how God made women to be subservient to men, and that men had to take care of them, almost making them seem like infants, that they weren't able to take care of themselves. And I remember, and so I remember that sat so wrong with me. And by this point I was 23. So I knew enough that what he was saying wasn't okay, but I didn't know how to address it. And so after he went on this tirade, a small group of women and I left during the tirade and realized that we weren't alone in realizing what he was saying was extremely harmful. And it was the first time realizing I wasn't alone and that maybe we could do something about it. And so fast forward to a couple of months later, I worked with women who I gave talks to I guess, programs at schools, and young girls would come up to me afterwards, specifically in Kenya, and tell me and ask me about female circumcision. And I remember being really taken aback when they first asked me that, because while I had heard about it in college, we called it female genital mutilation. It was really damaging, really harmful. It wasn't something that I thought I would ever encounter or talk to someone who had ever survived it. And yet these young girls were telling me that they were survivors of they called it female circumcision, but female genital mutilation.
Mm-hmm.
And you could tell they were really questioning it and like wanting to push back against it. And I think having, the opportunity to talk to someone from a different culture and see, hey, does this happen over here? What's happening with us? Is this right? Is it wrong? Kind of thing. And so I remember digging into the recesses of mine. The first time someone asked me it, I just said, no, that's not practiced in the United States. Yet it is actually. There's a famous case in Michigan where they tried to ban it, and then the Michigan judge defended it. So I could go more into details, but if you Google it, there is actually some parts of the United States that still practice female genital mutilation. It's definitely not as prevalent as Africa, where I was, but specifically in Kenya, where I was, but it was really eye-opening. And so these girls would talk to me about it. I did some research the next time so I could come prepared and answer their question in a better way, and started talking about the harms of how, it makes sex extremely, it takes away all pleasure, and it makes it extremely painful. So if people aren't familiar with female genital mutilation, it's where either the clitoris or the whole of the external genitalia for girls is removed in an effort to control women's sexuality. And so it makes sex extremely painful. It's a procedure that is not done with any scientific or medical training. And it's quite common for girls to bleed to death because there isn't any kind of safe procedure or anything like that happening around it. In addition to that, it makes childbirth more painful. It increases all of these other issues that have to do with that region. And so like there's, incontinence, all these other, just a host of medical issues, not to mention the fact that this procedure happens without any anesthesia while the girls are awake around the ages of 11 and 12, and they're usually held down.
What in the world?
Yeah. So not only is this extremely physically damaging, it's extremely emotionally damaging, which makes sense that these girls were starting to question it. And so I went and I asked my contact about it, and it turns out that in this village, all of the girls between the ages of 11 and 13 had endured it. And he told me that he used to hide girls who were trying to escape it in his church, but that it was such a strong tradition that it wasn't changed, and it was hard to change. And it was just really completely eye-opening to me that this was happening. And at the same time, not only was I hearing stories about female genital mutilation, I was also hearing stories of girls not being allowed to get an education. They would talk to me about how they had to fight so hard for their education while their male counterparts were allowed to go and encouraged to go to school, and how they had all of the chores and their brothers didn't. And they would talk to me about even sexual abuse. Is actually the first time that someone told me that they were raped. And it was during this time that I started questioning these teachings of like women, the same kind of teachings that I grew up with, like women should be in the home, they should take care of the house, and what the ramifications were in the society. So in this case, it kept young girls from going to school and made them responsible for all of and there was a lot more chores, like getting water. So they would walk miles to get water and all of these other things. And I started to notice a tie to this kind of damaging theology that I had grown up with and had just experienced several months previous, and the actual real life ramifications of what that looks like.
Yes.
And so I continued on. And it was several months later, I was in India working with women who were sex trafficked from Nepal. And so how that works is Nepal is a country that there's a lot of poverty there. And so oftentimes people will try to migrate to India in hopes, there's also a lot of poverty in India, but in hopes to get a better life. And so these traffickers will go to these impoverished villages in Nepal and say, hey, give me your kid and I will take them to India and get them a good job and send money home to you. But really they're taking their children and putting them into the slave trade. And so I worked with women who had been trafficked from Nepal. And the contact that I worked with there, his name was Aditya, and he started a daycare center for these women. So he was a native, he's from India. The city was Navi Mumbai. And he would, start this daycare because he had a young boy tell him that he used to have to hide under his mother's bed while she was being trafficked. And so while she was with a client, he was hiding underneath the bed. And so it helped him realize that these children have nowhere to go. And these obviously women don't have a choice because they're being trafficked by pimps. And so he started a daycare center and just took care of their kids while the moms had to deal with clients. And while I was there, I met a young girl who was being raised by the pimp who sold her mother. She was 5 years old, malnourished, clearly wasn't cared for. And it turns out that she had a hearing impediment, that she couldn't, she could hear if you yelled, but if you talked at a normal volume, she couldn't hear you. And there was nothing done to help her to communicate. So she had no way to communicate with others. And I think that was just the moment of just having my heart completely wrecked and broken, more so than it ever had been before, because this young girl was being raised by the pimp who sold her mother, and on top of that didn't have a way to communicate. And so I remember talking to our contact about it, like the situation that was there, and he said that there was nothing we could really do besides like pray and love her and take care of her now, because if you kidnapped her, the pimps would be violent. The police were bought off by the pimps. It was just a whole corrupt system. But the good news there is that Aditya continued to work with this young girl, and now she is safe. She has been given, he said medicine in her ears, but I'm guessing hearing aids that lost, different languages, where she's able to hear and is going to school now. And so now he is taking care of her. But I think the thing that really broke me that month is just it was month after month after month of seeing the oppression and marginalization of women, and seeing these similar gender roles I was taught be played out to a much stronger degree, much more powerful degree. And I could really see the effects there. And I decided that I wanted to do something about it. And so to bring me to where I am now, I continued to work with this missions organization. We did inner healing retreats for women who had come out of the sex trade. And I did that for about a year, and lived with women specifically in Philippines who had left the sex trade, or trafficked, left being trafficked to get a college education. And it was one night when I was there, the way that trafficking works there is there's these bars, and they almost have these women in underwear, and sometimes they'll have numbers on them, sometimes not, but men watch them when they're on stage, and they point a laser at the girls they want, and then that's how they get them for the night. And I was there talking to a girl. It was her first night there. She was telling me her story. A lot of these women just come from the most just extreme poverty and oppression, but it was her first night there. She had a boyfriend and a child, but her boyfriend was extremely abusive. She was showing me where he had cigarette burns, and she said, I have no way to provide for my child except to do this. And so I was talking to her, and as I was talking to her, these men came up and wanted to buy her. Technically, she should have a choice there, but these drunk guys weren't taking no for an answer. She was saying no, I was saying no, and then they started grabbing her. And so eventually, I didn't know what else to do. A teammate ran up and well, why don't we just buy her first? And so the whole crazy concept of purchasing her, and then they still tried to take her, which led us to get into a fight with these guys, a verbal fight, not a physical altercation with these guys, got the bar managers involved. The whole bar was staring at us. And eventually won this argument, but over this period of time, these men got more heated and more heated and more heated. And we won the argument, could prove that we paid for her first. I don't know what the miscommunication was. These guys were from South Korea, they didn't speak English, but they were very drunk and very angry. And they just pulled another girl off the stage. And I remember her looking back at us, and I felt like I had made the situation worse, because now not only was this woman getting taken by these 6 men to 1 girl, these men were now very angry. And I had a friend or a woman that I worked with in the past that was actually murdered by a client. So it was just devastating, because I felt like I had made the situation worse. And it really had me start asking questions. Why is this happening? Like, we can help women, and that's a noble cause, but why is it that there's so many men willing to buy trafficked women that don't have any other options? Sometimes they're literally like kidnapped, have no other options. Sometimes it's a matter of circumstance that they don't have education, they don't have a way to provide their children, and it's like, I either do this to feed my kids or there's no other option. I'm like, what? But why men? Why are there so much demand? Why is this happening? Why aren't we making a difference? Or like, at least it felt like we would help one person, when, like I said, in that moment, so easily replaced. And really had me start to dive into these scripts that we give men and women on how to behave in the world. And the idea that really sent that idea home was the next night I was talking to a man, an American man. He called our group over. He's like, "Why are you here?" And we were telling him that, we were partnering with a ministry that put girls through college. And he went on like a tirade about how women here were raised right and they know how to respect men, where women in the United States are too uppity and like don't know their place. And that's when the connection happened for me. I was asking this question, why? And here was one of many men, because this wasn't the first time I heard it, saying, I come here to get the respect I deserve. I come here to buy and traffic women because they give me the respect that I deserve. And that's when I made the connection, like, this sounds like the pastors I had growing up about how important it was to respect men no matter what. And this need for respect, this entitlement for respect. And I saw the fruit of that teaching. Yeah. And not only had I seen it in the sex trade, I had seen it with these gender roles that I saw in Kenya, where women were had female genital mutilation and were often sexually and physically abused. I saw it in my own upbringing, where I was sexually assaulted and I thought it was my fault because purity culture told me it was my fault. And so it was this huge moment of breakthrough that I'm like, the why is these gender roles about men being dominant. Listen to them. They need respect. This respect is not a want, it's a need, and you have to get it. And if you don't get it, then you're entitled to get it in whatever way. And we see this kind of talking in marriage books. Like, think of Love and Respect. Men need respect. Women need love. But this whole idea of this need for dominance and respect, that's prevalent within the church and without the church. And that was my moment of revelation. I'm like, okay, I need to address these power differentials. I need to address these gender roles, which ultimately led me to reclaim feminism for the Christian faith, because I believe Jesus was and is a feminist and talked about equality between the sexes and demonstrated that in the way he interacted with women. And so I think the church for too long has been an upholder of harmful power differentials that prime the ground for abuse, which you're, I'm sure, all too familiar with. But that was my moment of realization, is like, these are not just like inconvenient truths that I don't like. These are like damaging, very hurtful, leading to women getting, brutalized and in the sex trade and being trafficked because of these power differentials that we see.
Right. Yes, I do see the fallout of all of that. Yeah. It's interesting because what you just described, I was thinking about the difference between a hardcore porn and soft porn. Mm-hmm. It's like hardcore misogyny and soft misogyny. Mm-hmm. We sort of peddle a soft misogyny here in the church over here in America. Right. And they've got the hardcore stuff. Well, we have the hardcore stuff here too. Right. But the church doesn't peddle it. But the church still peddles it. Mm-hmm. It's still the same thing. Mm-hmm. Misogyny, it's still the same underlying things. And we don't we're not selling women to strangers, but we're selling them to their husbands. And we're saying you belong to this man now. And so he owns you. He decides, makes all the decisions. He decides if you work or don't work. He decides what you do if you are going to work. He decides when you're going to sleep with him. He decides, and it's okay for him to do that. That's not abusive at all. That's like normal. That's in fact, not only normal, it's godly.
Yeah.
That's a godly thing to do. So, okay. So you quit your job eventually.
Yes. I quit my job actually right after that night when I had the profound realization of it. Especially because the organization that I was working for definitely had some of these patriarchal, not good things. And I had confronted it in the organization, but it just really felt time to leave. So yeah, I quit my job 3 weeks later.
Okay. So, I mean, can you give an example of what kinds of things you were seeing? Like maybe give an example of something that you were seeing where you were working that just didn't.
Yeah. So one of the things, I actually called this out in my organization. So in many ways, like my organization they said indeed that, we believe in women's empowerment and leadership. And to a degree that was true, yet, we would push for women to be in leadership, but that wouldn't change. They wouldn't put women on their board and their senior leadership. And specifically, they were doing this whole campaign. I talk about this in my book. They were doing this whole campaign about how they were training missionaries to look for the man of peace, which was this biblical concept, which is also known as house of peace. And it really is a gender neutral term, but they kept on, I was in the marketing department, and they kept on pushing this word man of peace. And so my coworkers confronted it and it didn't change. And so I remember talking to my boss and I said, hey, do you think this language is inclusive? Does it include women? Because right now it just seems like men are the only ones that we can steward with the gospel message. And she said, yeah, I pushed back against it, but they didn't listen. So I encourage you to have a conversation with them. And so my opportunity came quickly. There's this whole big meeting they had, I think it was like once a month, where employees were allowed to ask questions of the organization. And as predicted, the senior leadership member was talking about this whole concept of man of peace. And I really leaned over to my boss and I said, is this a good time to ask a question if women are included in this as well? And so she said, this is a perfect opportunity. It was what the meeting was designed for. So I pushed my hand up in the air and I said, does this term include women as well? And he got very upset, flew off the handle, started talking about how I was accusing him of sexism, how I was like, how could I even ask that question? And just went on a tirade and made fun of me and turned my question into a joke in front of this whole meeting, which was probably about 50 or 60 people. And so of course I, sat my seat back down, like, okay, like, I guess I shouldn't have asked that question, but I heard people murmuring behind me, Megan, that was a good question. The meeting finished. I had 3 people immediately rush up to me and said, that was handled so inappropriately. I'm going to be following up with an email, and I hope that you do too. And so I followed up with an email. These other people followed up with an email, and through a series of conversations, the language was changed because the language is important that we use. But even at the end of that, he asked to have a meeting with me, and he said that I was wrong because I asked my question out of offense. And so it felt weird because it felt like a victory. Okay, I got them to be more inclusive, but the way the situation was handled, it was like, you never should have spoken up in the first place. And that was just like one of several things, but just this kind of idea of like, we say that we're for women, but when that's questioned, or if that's not being shown up and you ask questions about it, we're going to make you an example of how not to behave.
Right.
And that was one of the reasons I knew it was time to leave. But like I said, it was not until I was leading a trip for them, and it was, like I said, 3 weeks. I was actually 3 weeks before I got married. And that push is what really is like, I don't actually think this is where I should be spending my time. I don't feel like I'm being heard here. So I'm going to go and try and get other people to reclaim gender equity for the church. So
yeah.
Okay.
So were there other times then after that you were resisting patriarchal teachings in the church and speaking up for women's rights?
After that,
what happened?
Oh yeah. I mean, of course, I heard a podcast called Faith and Feminism. Of course, that got me in so much trouble. Oh my God, I'm serious. Like
What does that mean? What does that mean? You got in trouble. What happened?
Okay, I'll tell you. So, I was getting, like I said, I just had gotten married. Prior to getting married, my in-laws are very conservative, and my father-in-law kept on telling me the story about how in his marriage vows, it said that my wife, like Deb, his wife, said to obey my husband was in the vows. And his friend came up to him afterwards and said, "That's so awesome. How do you get your woman to obey you?" And he's like,
"Oh my God,
no, this is a real story." And then he said, "No, this is just the Christian way." And he told that story to me twice before I got married, but I didn't know how to address it because I wanted him to like me. I want my in-laws to like me. And so I just wouldn't say anything. And I felt like the first time I didn't respond, that's why he told us the second time. I don't know. But anyways, if that gives you a primer of what I was marrying into. And so they just kind of relentlessly trolled all of my social media channels. I actually eventually had to block them. We had to cancel trips home for Thanksgiving. It was actually a very, very painful time in our life. And I think especially for my husband, because my husband obviously is a feminist. I wouldn't have married him if he wasn't, but he wasn't outspoken about it. And so now that I was outspoken, it led them to kind of talk to Dustin, they would troll my social media, and then they would send an email to Dustin, kind of like, "Get your wife in line."
Wow.
And yeah.
Oh my gosh, like they're in control of you as adults.
He would
Crazy.
they would reprimand him instead of me. They would reprimand me publicly, but then send a long email to him. And so that was frustrating to me. I'm like, talk to me if you have the problem, but also at the same time, it's like your theology prohibits you from learning from women. Literally, this is part of your theology. So I don't know why we're having these conversations.
Right.
So it was really painful for him. We both had, Dustin and I, my husband, had to go to therapy, to talk to therapists, individually, just about obviously, he had a great childhood until this, and now it felt like he was kind of excommunicated. They told us that we were false teachers. They hinted that we were going to hell, all just because we believed in women's equality. Yeah. And then I had friends who told me that they couldn't be associated with me because it would tie them to the liberal agenda. I had one of my very dear friends send me a message saying she couldn't be connected to me on my birthday. So yeah, it cost a lot to speak up. But at the same time, something I have learned so powerfully is I'm not concerned about the critics. I'm concerned about who I use my voice for. And it's for, what were the last 4 years of missions work if it didn't change me, if I didn't see their stories as something as worthy to fight for. And if I know what's harming them, how could I just walk away from that and be like, "Oh, that's fine. I'll be comfortable over here and not talk about this." And not only was it what happened to them, it's what happened to me. It also opened my eyes to all of the abuse and sexual assault and stuff that I had endured, that I was told it was my fault. And so yeah, I've gotten in trouble, and I've lost friends, and my family's been disappointed in me, and the list goes on. But at the same time, that's not who I speak for. And I feel I feel so close to God, because I truly believe this is God's work. This is not something I had an idea about. This is, of course, women's equality matters to God. Of course, God cares about women and stories of abuse. Of course, of course, of course. And so I'm just so confident that this is what God has called me to do, that even when this does happen, and that's not to say it doesn't painful. I do cry a lot, but I see my therapist, I talk about it, and I recover and remember that the why of I tell this story, where I tell my story, where I tell these stories, because it has an effect, honestly. What we believe about our gender roles really does have profound effects, not only here, but around the world.
It does. When I totally relate to the idea, the feeling that I feel like I'm aligned with God, the heart of the love of God now, in a way that I wasn't before, when I was buying into and catering to all of the really, it's really hateful underneath all of it.
Right.
I mean, it's got a nice little pink bow on the top, some frosting on it, but it's not cake underneath there. It's a pile of poo,
Right.
And so once you see that, the loving thing to do is to say, this is not like, I don't want anyone to eat this. This is not healthy. Let's go for the real thing. Okay. So, now my audience they're women of faith and they love Jesus with all their hearts. And a lot of them are in marriages that are, like my former marriage it's a complementarian marriage and they come from that kind of theology. And one of the things that I noticed when I was getting out of my former marriage and I ended up getting remarried, and we do not have a complementarian second. I don't have a complementarian second marriage, thank goodness. But even the marriages that I noticed that were actually pretty healthy in the complementarian church that I went to, they actually didn't function where the guy was the one ruling the roost and making all the decisions and treating his wife like crap. They actually functioned more like an egalitarian marriage. They were partners. They were a team. And when I would look at marriages like that in my former marriage, I would think, I wish my marriage could be like that. And I didn't know at the time but those women in those marriages would say, oh, this is a true complementarian marriage. I am very submissive to my husband. I do whatever he tells me to do. But on a functional level, that wasn't actually what was going on. But all the rest of us that were in abusive marriages, we were looking at that going, well, I do that too, but my marriage looks nothing like that. So can you talk a little bit about, I'm assuming your marriage is not complementarian.
No.
So what do you say when people ask you, how is your marriage functioning when you don't have someone to make the decisions for you?
Yeah. So it's funny, like now, like with a podcast, Faith and Feminism, I don't get that question as much. But
do they leave you alone now? They're like, oh, we can't touch her now. She's like totally off the deep end.
Yeah. I'm like,
she's a lost cause.
Yeah. No, so it's funny. So I wrote the book I wrote. They sent my book to beta readers, I guess is what you would call it. They sent it to 3 different demographics of I guess, women in different demographics. And it was very clear that they sent my book to a woman in a complementarian marriage. And something she asked is like, but like, because I wrote a chapter on marriage, but she's like, but how does your marriage function? Or actually I hadn't written a chapter on marriage yet. And then I added that afterwards because she's like, I don't understand how this works. So it's actually really simple. I think we've been taught a bunch of formulas, which aren't really helpful. And also formulas don't work, like with people, they don't really work. I think obviously I live in an egalitarian marriage, but I think it's really, really simple. We talk to each other and we listen to each other and we empower one another. And so a kind of an example, or the example I use in my book is I knew I needed to quit my job after that night that I described to you earlier. And instead of my husband being like, oh no, you to submit and earn money, or I don't know, it wasn't like, he just empowered me. He's like, you know what, Meghan, you're right. This is something that needs to be addressed. Go for it. And so after we got married, he's a chemical engineer. He was a chemical engineer and he hated his job. He worked in a factory. And the way he was raised is like, you kind of just do this. This is what you do to earn money. And my role as a man is to earn money. And I'll do this terrible job, even though I hate it every day. And I was like, you don't have to do this job. Like we can survive without it. And so I encouraged him to, quit his chemical engineering job and go back to coding school, computer programming school. And now we both work from home and he's a coder and he loves it. And I think that's just a small illustration of like, just listen to one another, support each other in the best way you know how. It's not like, oh, you're the man, you have to keep on providing for the family, and I'm the wife, so I need to, immediately have a bunch of children and cook dinner and clean the house, all the like that was not it. It's just allowing us to function in our giftings. And when it comes to household duties, we split it up according to our giftings. And so who's mowing the lawn, who's like doing all of the yard work, that's me because I like it and I enjoy it. He is not doing that work because he has allergies and we live in Georgia. And so he goes out there and works on the lawn or in the garden and he's covered in hives and I enjoy it. And so he actually always is emptying the dishwasher and cooking. So like, it's just an example of like, play to your gifts. I hate emptying the dishwasher. And so he does that for me. And
that is awesome.
I love gardening. I love yard work. I like mowing the lawn. I have a Apple Watch and I have a move goal. I'm trying to burn 500 calories every day. And so I'm like, yeah, I want to mow the lawn. It's like another opportunity to
right. Exactly.
So I think the answer is just talk and listen to each other and try and empower and support one another in the best way possible. I've only been married for 4 years now, but that's worked really great for us. And we both work from home. And so it's not even like, I mean, whatever we're doing is working because we're with each other 24/7 and we still love each other and love spending time with each other and even miss each other. We're apart from each other.
Oh, that is so awesome. Yeah. And I hope that gives listeners hope because I know a lot of my listeners are either separated or they're in the process of getting divorced and they wonder, are there healthy relationships out there? Is that something that could be a reality for me? And I want them to know that is definitely a reality out there. Not all men have that kind of theology that believes those harmful things against women. Okay. So to wrap up, let's talk about your book just a little bit here. Okay. So your new, now, is it released? This is going to air in the future, but when is the release date?
May 11th.
May 11th. Okay. So this will be out by that time. Tell us about why you wrote that book and what you're hoping that it will do in the world.
Yeah. So it's funny. So when I first had this idea to write a book, I really was gung-ho about writing a memoir because I really wanted people to identify. I wanted them to see themselves in my story. And I think what I found over and over and over again is that when we have conversations, when we tell our stories, we are so much less alone than we think we are. And a lot of the things that were harmful to us and we were told were good were actually harmful to others. And they were questioning it, but they just felt like they couldn't talk about it. And so I remember when I was pitching it to the publisher, they're like, well, memoir doesn't really sell as well as nonfiction books. So I want you to consider that. I'm like, okay, well, I have this first draft of a memoir, a very rough, it was terrible. It was not good. Very rough first draft of a memoir. Can you read it and let me know what you think? Because I feel pretty strongly about the memoir. And they read it and they're like, yeah, you do. We'll do the memoir.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. So the reason I wrote it as a memoir is because I think the listeners, especially, you've already described your audience. I think they're going to read this story and they're going to see themselves in it again and again and again and again. And that was my hope, is that I think so often we don't think what the bad stuff that happens to us, we think it's just us. We don't realize that there's so many other people, but we also don't realize that the bad stuff that happens to us happens to women around the globe to differing extremes, right? But it's the same root cause. And so the reason I wanted to tell it as a memoir is I want you to see my story. I want you to identify with it, but I also want you to know at the end of it that you do have a voice, and this is how you can come through that out of it. And that this is why this theology is damaging, and a firsthand account that this is how we can come out of it. And one of my favorite, teachings from the Bible is talking about, we know a fruit by its, or I know a tree by its fruit. And the question I'm asking is, what kind of fruit does this biblical gender role theology produce? And it's very, very clear, not only for your listeners, but around the world, this kind of theology is producing rotten, damaging, toxic fruit.
Yep.
And so if we're taking the Bible seriously in that way, then we know that we have to confront these teachings, or abuse is just going to keep on happening in the church, and not just in the church, but we're going to be complicit in the abuse that happens elsewhere. Like I said, a lot of these ideas are exported. Like a lot of these women who are trafficked are being purchased by Western American men with these ideals.
Wow.
So I want them to see themselves in the story. I want them to find the courage to confront these gender roles. And if they haven't already started questioning it, and I want them to know that they're not alone. I want them to feel seen and heard, and also empowered to do something. And so that's my hope with it.
Yeah, I love that. I love the name of it too. Women Rising. I'm all about the flying. So
yes.
Okay, so can they get it on Amazon or you sent me a link, an early link, but it was not on Amazon. So I just want to make sure they can get it on Amazon.
You can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. My publisher is InterVarsity Press, which is a Christian publisher, so you can find them as well there. You can pre-order on Amazon. So if this is getting released before May 11th, please pre-order it. That would help me so much. But yeah, you can do it on Amazon or InterVarsity Press. If you just search Women Rising and my name, you'll find the book.
Okay, great. So, and I will, for those of you who are listening, or even on YouTube, I will have the links in the show notes. If you go to flyingfreenow.com/119, that's the number of this episode. So flyingfreenow.com/119. I will link to Meghan's podcast. We'll link to her website. We'll link to her books and any other helps that she has for you guys. And you guys can get to know Meghan a little bit better. Okay. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been great to talk to you and hear your story and get to know you a little bit. And for those of you who are listening, thanks for listening. Until next time, fly free.